Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture, where we examine the treasures in the biblical text. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel 5, we read about Belshazzar, the son of the last king of Babylon, Nabonidus. In this chapter, Belshazzar reads the handwriting on the wall, literally, and the handwriting spells his doom. Daniel explains that it's because he shows absolutely no sign of humility before the God of gods, and it seems that Belshazzar thinks he can buy his way out of his problem by offering wealth to the prophet. But he's going to learn that wealth cannot stop God's wrath. So today we are in the middle of the book of Daniel in chapter 5. Now, I just want to start with verse 1 of chapter 5 and then make some observations about it. Chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great festival for 1,000 of his lords, and in the presence of the 1,000 lords he was drinking wine. Now that might not seem like an odd statement, starting a new chapter, starting a new story. But if you've been following along and reading through the book of Daniel, what would strike you as surprising about this verse?
Immediately, we were just talking about Nebuchadnezzar.
Right. Where is Nebuchadnezzar? we ended the last chapter. Nebuchadnezzar was back on the throne after having his bout of insanity. And now he's gone? Here we are introduced to Belshazzar. Where has he been this whole time? Has there been any mention of him before this? No, there has not. Belshazzar just appears, and Nebuchadnezzar just disappears between chapters 4 and 5, with no help from the narrator to let us know anything about what happened in between, or anything, or how much time has elapsed. You know how much time has elapsed between chapter 4 and chapter 5? Not from this verse. It's just suddenly a new world, and we start at the beginning of this chapter. Yes?
I think I'm still waking up because for a second I thought that was Daniel's name, Belshazzar. I'm like, wait, when was he king? Like, I got to figure out.
That's right.
I didn't see.
Belteshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's name for Daniel. Right, with a T-E there in the middle of it. I meant to go back before I started teaching this morning to confirm exactly what Belteshazzar means in distinctive from Belshazzar. Belshazzar, I did read as I was preparing for this lesson, that means may Bel, the god of the Babylonians, may Bel protect the king. So Belshazzar has that Babylonian god's name in the name, Belshazzar. And that same root is part of Belteshazzar, I'm sure. It's just saying something a little different about what the god Bel should do for the person with the name Belteshazzar. So that's one reason why when we talk, you see mentioned through chapters 1 through 4 when it talks about Belteshazzar, that Daniel has a name after my gods. Well, that's because his name literally has the name of a Babylonian god in it. Just like Daniel has El, a nod to the Israelite God in it, which is still not as explicit as, say, Isaiah, which has elements of Yahweh, the personal name of God, in his name. Or Jeremiah, the at the end is that part of Yahweh in his name. So Daniel and Belshazzar, but putting the name of a god or a designation for a god in your name was very common back then, especially if you were a king, because you wanted that association of the gods with you and your reign and influence.
If he had a festival for 1,000 lords, why was he the only one drinking wine?
It's right. I think probably they all were, but actually, according to a tradition which I learned by listening to the CD of Dr. David Jeremiah, discussed this passage. He said, and I didn't take the time to go back and verify it independently, but he said in his own research he had found that in this day and age, drinking was normally a private affair for the king in his own apartment. Drinking in the public was just not done. So this emphasis of him drinking in front of 1,000 lords is a bit of a social faux pas at minimum, and especially drinking enough to get drunk. That would have been totally unacceptable for a king in that day and age. But the suggestion here is that Belshazzar is ignoring social convention and just throwing a grand party and throwing social convention and propriety and everything out the window for his own enjoyment.
Maybe he was showing off of that he was the king. I'm drinking wine. You're not.
Showing off is definitely in the mix for what Belshazzar is doing in this chapter at the beginning of it. And there's an irony in that when we get to the end of the chapter. I'll get a little bit further in before I discuss why it's totally ironic for him to be throwing such a shindig at this point in his reign. Let me give you a little bit of an overview, because actually, even if we just get reoriented to the fact, okay, there's a new king here, there was Nebuchadnezzar, and now there's Belshazzar, even that is a little bit misleading, because there were actually multiple kings between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. There is lots of time in between even those two people. So the narrator of the book of Daniel is not giving us much information to go on about when things are happening and what and exactly how they relate to each other chronologically, which I find ironic in its own way, because so many take the details of Daniel 7 through 12 to be very precise about dating in times things with all of their specific dates. But Daniel 1 through 6 is very casual about when things happened, and we actually have to go in and infer, based on internal and external evidence, what the dating of things is. The book itself is very unconcerned with the chronologies of these events, which I find ironic, given how much stress there is on chronologies of events based on the eschatological or end time stuff.
Daniel as a whole, you have to view it as like I said before, a collection of stories. Like it's not designed to be a chronological essay of this is what happened and when it happened. This is
Right.
designed to come to very specific points about the relation of God and government.
Oh, I agree. That's the focus. The focus is not when, but what and why. And even more why. Because we have in this chapter, okay, spoiler alert, the fall of Babylon to the Medes and Persians. This chapter is very unconcerned about how that happened. It's very concerned about why. That's the whole point of this chapter. And it's not concerned about what or when it happened, but why did it happen? That's the whole emphasis of this chapter. Now we, of course, want to know when, and we want to know how. As modern readers of the text, we get very focused on when and how. And so I made this timeline with the reigns of these actually Babylonian kings. So the story begins actually before the timeline starts, with the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign in 605 BC. Daniel then in chapter 1, about 605 BC, would be approximately 20 years old, give or take a couple of years probably, because we don't have his age specifically given either. So the age of Daniel is another one of these unknowns. But he would have been a young man at least, so it's sometime in the 20s or late teens or early 20s. And then Daniel chapter 2, it's happening basically concurrently with some of the events at the end of chapter 1. So just maybe 2 years later, 603 BC, Daniel about 22 years old in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, there's a big jump. We don't know exactly how long, because again, Daniel doesn't tell us, the book doesn't tell us. But there is a tradition that would date it to about 18 years later, that the Septuagint copy of the book of Daniel actually, that's the Greek copy. The Greek copy actually dates it 18 years later, which puts it conveniently enough at the same year that Nebuchadnezzar would sack Jerusalem and finally destroy it and put it to its end. The dating of the Septuagint, that it is exactly 18 years later with the sack of Jerusalem, scholars look at that and say, well, that's awfully convenient that the timing would be just like that, when with all these other Hebrew copies of it, we don't have a date at all. But it's sometime later. At that point, then Daniel is probably around 40 years old. So he went from his 20s in chapter 1 and 2 to his 40s approximately in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, we just have no idea, because there's not enough internal or external evidence for when the events of chapter 4 happened. When Nebuchadnezzar has his mental break, and we know it must have been a time of peace in his kingdom, because he's king at the beginning and at the end, and it would have been too much turmoil for that to happen any other time, but when exactly we don't know. It had to be before 562 BC, because that's when Nebuchadnezzar died. So sometime between 587 and 562, chapter 4 happens. And then we do know the timing of chapter 5, again, not because of anything Daniel tells us, but because we know when Babylon fell from external sources. We know when it fell, and so we know the timing of chapter 5, which is in 539 BC, and Daniel is approximately then 90. So from 20s to 40s to now 90s, 80s, 90s, because we don't know exactly his age, in age. So he grows up a lot in this book. So the party continues in verses 2 through 4. When he tasted the wine, Belshazzar commanded that they bring the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his predecessor, had taken from the temple that was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, may drink from them. Then they brought in the vessels of gold that they took from the temple, the house of God that was in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. But these are the common materials used to make idols. So that's the implication, is that they're using the utensils from the one true God of Israel to honor the gods that are idols and worshipped by idols. So that's their act. But we can see, again, more of Belshazzar's flouting decency and order, even in their own society, even notwithstanding the fact that they didn't have the high moral standards of the Jews from the Torah. Even their own Babylonian senses of propriety were just being flouted at this party, because it was simply not proper for the women to be in there drinking with the guys in one big party. And that's the implication here, is that the wives and his concubines, just everybody, is in there in this big free-for-all party that Belshazzar is hosting. And that certainly wouldn't be proper. And then, of course, to take sacred elements, even if they're not your own gods, something that's been dedicated to a god, and using it for common drinking cups would have been also unfathomable by their culture. They might have melted down those other gods' stuff so that they could refashion it, but they wouldn't just take something that had been dedicated to a god and use it in their common drinking cup. That would just not have been done. So Belshazzar is Belshazzar is undermining all of these social conventions.
Do you think he was doing this to, he was using the instruments that our God were dedicated to him to praise his gods? Maybe he was saying that this God was inferior to all of their gods.
I think that is part of the message that he wants to send. Yes, and every conflict in that day and age was understood to be a conflict of gods and men, and that conflict between nations reflected the relative superiority of one God over another as well as one nation over another. We're just seen as the same thing. If my God was greater than your God, then I could take over your country. And if not, then I could either not take over your country or you would take over mine. That was just how most conflicts were cast in as well you know from the literature of the time. It was that. And so yes, to demean the God of Israel was to suggest that your God was greater than the God of Israel and that was superior.
Well, I think even beyond that, this was a personal thing. Like this is not just him destroying another culture's God. This was him saying he's better than all of them because he's doing things that cause their own social conventions. Mm-hmm. So he's better than all the gods at this point in his own mind.
Right.
In this particular translation, it says that his predecessor, in the one that I have, it says his father. And I know that means like the
forefathers.
Forefathers, right. But to me, that's what he's saying is that I am better than even Nebuchadnezzar. I am better than all of my forefathers because look at what I can do.
Right. Well, it's probably apropos at this point to give the whole story, why it is ironic for him to be throwing this party. Because the Medo-Persian armies are at his doorstep. And he knows it. He couldn't not know it. His father, Nabonidus, who is technically the king at this time. That's another thing. If you're historically aware and you read about these ancient cultures, you will not read about a King Belshazzar. Because he was never officially the king. His father, Nabonidus, was the king. However, we know from records, and this is from extra-biblical sources, that Nabonidus spent time away from his capital. Sometimes he was in battle, and sometimes he just was off. I'll just throw this in here because it's a little bit interesting. In the texts that were discovered at Qumran, which we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a text discovered in that group that's called the Prayer of Nabonidus. Now, that's Belshazzar's father. This Prayer of Nabonidus document talks about Nabonidus having a period where he is mentally unstable. He goes away from his kingdom for a while, is acting oddly like an animal, and then is restored to his sanity through a Jewish mystic. Sounds a lot like Daniel chapter 4, but it's described to Nabonidus, not to Nebuchadnezzar. But it tells us that maybe the situation with Nebuchadnezzar was not unique, but Nabonidus is also said to have been away. And documents say that he was away living in another place outside the capital for like 10 years or 15 years. It was a long time. He was away. And his son, Belshazzar, and we know that that was his son's name, his name was on official court documents. Other events that would be normally ascribed to the king, Belshazzar's name appears in the official history that we can gather from Babylon. So, yes, Belshazzar was king in all but name, technically. So there might be a little faux pas, if you will, or historical inaccuracy for the book of Daniel to call him king, but he was. He was the power in charge. So he was functionally the king when all of these things happened. Nabonidus might have been away at battle, actually, at this point, because the Medo-Persians are pressing, and there are battles being had around Babylon as the Medo-Persians are making their way towards the capital. So he may be gone for that. But nevertheless, this party seems to be a last gasp. It is either an act of desperation or a simple, let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die sort of thing. But while he can, he's going to rub his nose in the other gods of the nations and try to maybe recapture some of this air of superiority. Because really at this point it is only an air of superiority. It isn't actual superiority because he's losing this battle to the Persians. He's going to try to recapture some of that sense. And so I think that explains some of his casting off of all social mores, of all restraint, because he knows things aren't going well. and he's just trying to live it up one last night. Maybe he thinks he can win. There's a suggestion that he might think he can win, but I think that in his heart he knows he can't. Well, he's having this big party when the hand of God appears, if you will, in verses 5 through 6. Immediately, human fingers appeared, and they wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the palace of the king, and the king was watching the palm of the hand that was writing. Then his face changed, and his thoughts terrified him, and his hip joints gave way, and his knees knocked together. I love that detail about his knees knocking together. I don't know why it's sort of cartoonish to think of somebody like that, but that's how it's described. I looked into the original languages, and that, it pretty much just says his knees knocked together. It's not a paraphrase for our modern ear. It's what it says about how he responded. Now, I read various commentaries. Some commentaries apparently think this is a vision, that there isn't a hand that everybody in the hall could see, just Belshazzar could see it. Others would just simply say it did happen, appeared so that everybody could see, wrote these words on the wall. The detail of the plaster on the wall is interesting because there was only one reason to plaster a wall in that day and age, and that was to write on it. The plaster is a superficial texture on the whatever the wall was made of, stone usually, so that you could inscribe on it. It was made to be inscribed on, and the plastered walls of the halls of the kings had their great acts written on them, just like those steels, the obelisks, and those what's the word, cylinder-like statues or images that they would put. They would inscribe their great acts. Well, they did that in their palaces as well. They inscribed on the walls their great acts of the king and of course the prior kings. Here I think the suggestion is that this hand is erasing the acts that were inscribed on the plaster to write its own words over them and to give that message, which may be why the king, of course it's frightening just to see a hand appear out of nowhere and start writing, but he was terrified. And it's similar to the reaction that Nebuchadnezzar had of his dreams, that his thoughts terrified him by seeing this hand. Well, his reaction is typical. He's in some ways just like Nebuchadnezzar. He has this event that he can't explain that's frightening to him, and so he calls in the conjurers, the astrologers, the diviners. This is verse 7. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Any man that can read this writing and can tell me its explanation will be clothed in purple and will have a necklace of gold hung around his neck, and he will rule as third in authority in the kingdom." Now, even though all of this is part of the section that's all in Aramaic, and therefore what's written on the walls is in Aramaic and would have been understood by anybody in Babylon, I think the implication is that he can't read them because perhaps they're in Hebrew. It's a related language, but it would have been odd enough that he wouldn't have been able to tell exactly what the word was if it was written in Hebrew and not Aramaic. Maybe that's why he can't read the words, because they're not in Aramaic per se. So he's looking for someone who can read them and, of course, then give an explanation. And he says they'll be clothed in purple and have a necklace of gold hung around his neck and rule as third in authority in the kingdom. Well, that nod to the third in authority of the kingdom, that might be a nod to the fact that Belshazzar is second in the kingdom under Nabonidus, the actual king. So that might recognize the fact that Daniel would be under Belshazzar as third. But still, Nabonidus has to know that things aren't going well for his country, so giving a promise of being third in a kingdom that's not going to last very long and being given all this royal robe and stuff, it's an interesting promise. Okay, verses 8 and 9. All the wise men of the king came in, but, surprise, they were not able to read the writing or to make known its explanation. Then the king, Belshazzar, became greatly terrified. His facial features changed upon him, and his lords were perplexed. So Again, the situation just goes from bad to worse when nobody can tell him what it means. And then we have an interesting person walk in from stage right and give some information. Daniel 5:10 through 12. Because of the words of the king and his lords, the queen came into the banqueting hall. It looks like the queen did not want to participate in the lewd and raucous party that Belshazzar was having. And you might assume that since he's called the king and this is the queen, that it would be his wife. However, probably not. Probably this is the queen mother. This is probably Nabonidus' wife, could be, or an even older generation woman, a queen from Nebuchadnezzar's day. And we know that from what she says. Let's hear what she says. O king, live forever, and let not your thoughts terrify you, and do not let your facial expressions grow pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. And in the days of your predecessor, enlightenment and insight and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. And O king Nebuchadnezzar, your predecessor, appointed him as chief of the magicians, the conjurers, the astrologers, and the diviners. Your predecessor, the king, did this because there was found in him an excellent spirit and understanding and insight for interpreting dreams and explaining riddles and solving riddles. That is, in Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will tell the explanation. So she has this history. She knows who Daniel is, knows how he was positioned in the realm of Nebuchadnezzar. That's why he's probably not Belshazzar's wife, but mother or even possibly grandmother, because she has that connection to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, why would Daniel not be in that position anymore? Well, because so much time has passed, there's been at least 3 kings in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and the position of highest court astrologer would have been at the behest of the king. So Daniel has just somehow fallen out of favor with the royal family since the death of Nebuchadnezzar. In a sense, this is another Joseph-like echo, where there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Well, here is a king who did not know Daniel. Daniel's alive, but this king doesn't know about him, or he would have asked him first. But the queen does, and she tells him all about it.
Daniel was a lot older by this time.
That's right. He was past his prime, you might say. He's in his 80s, so yes, maybe he had just retired from astrology work in Babylon at this point. Yeah, he was a lot older. But he's called in verses 13 through 16. Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "You are Daniel, you who are one of the exiles of Judah, whom my predecessor, the king, brought from Judah. And I have heard that a spirit of the gods is in you, and enlightenment and insight and excellent wisdom was found in you. And now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me so that they could read this writing in order to make its explanation known to me, but they were not able to disclose the explanation of the matter. But I have heard concerning you that you are able to produce interpretations and to solve riddles. Now, if you're able to read the writing and to make known its explanation to me, you will be clothed in purple and a necklace of gold and will be placed around your neck, and you will rule as third in command in the kingdom." All right, so Daniel gets the promised royalty, exaltation, if he can give the answer. But I love Daniel's answer in verse 17. And Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, or your rewards give to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, and I will make known to him the explanation." I don't need your money. I don't need your exaltation. I don't need your money. It would be a waste anyway. I think Daniel knows maybe better than Belshazzar the fix that he's in. So he says, just keep your money. But I will tell you what it means. Daniel 5:18 and 19. "O king, the most high God gave the kingdom and the greatness and the glory and the majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your predecessor. And because of the greatness that he gave to him, all the peoples, the nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wanted killed, and whomever he wanted he let live. And whomever he wanted he honored, and whomever he wanted he humbled." All right, so Daniel's going to bring Nebuchadnezzar into the mix. I think that we should understand from the fact that Nebuchadnezzar keeps kind of ghostly appearing in this story, almost like the hand, that we are meant to compare Belshazzar with Nebuchadnezzar, and probably with Cyrus, who comes after Belshazzar. These three kings are meant to be put next to each other for us to consider each one and what we can learn by comparing them against each other. So Daniel brings it out explicitly here.
This is coming across very much like an older man.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Back in my day.
Right.
But it's interesting to me that he's still known as an exile from Judah when he spent 3/4 of his life now in Babylon.
That's right, yeah.
Like, why is he still known as the exile from Judah?
Well, partly because he still goes by the name Daniel. Even the queen calls him Daniel.
That's right. They say he's also called Belteshazzar, but they call him Daniel. So yeah, he's holding on to that Jewish identity, that Judahite identity. So that's true.
Wonder why he didn't take the time to pray to God before he told him the answer like he did before.
He probably
He just read the writing on the wall.
Let us know.
You're right. Anyway, Daniel 5, 20 and 21. But when his heart became arrogant, that's when Nebuchadnezzar's heart became arrogant and his spirit became hard so as to act proudly, he was deposed from the throne of his kingdom and the glory was taken away from him. He was driven away from human society and his mind was made like the animals and his dwelling was with the wild asses. And he was given grass like oxen to eat, and with the dew of heaven his body was bathed, until he acknowledged that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of humankind, and whomever he wants, he sets over it. So as great as Nebuchadnezzar was, there's someone greater than him, and that is God Most High. This is something Nebuchadnezzar did eventually admit every time he was faced with this fact. Belshazzar is a different story. This is verses 22 and 23. But you, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. And now you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his temple you have brought in before you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone that do not see and do not hear and do not know. But the God who holds your life in his hand and all of your ways come from him, you have not honored. So that's the accusation. I think that just stands for itself. Remember that statue from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2? Well, that's the head of gold is about to get cut off. Daniel 5, 24 through 28. This is the last part of Daniel's explanation. So then the palm of the hand was sent out from his presence, and this writing was inscribed. Now this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the explanation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on scales and you have been found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Right. So this doesn't explicitly say it, but Mene is a Hebrew word for numbering, counting. And so God has counted your days and you're at the end of them. Tekel means weighed. So God has weighed you and you're wanting. I always remember that. Of all these three things, I love that. Weighed in the scales and found wanting. That's no good. And Peres is divided. Actually, that's hearkening all the way back to Genesis, because there was a person named Perez, the same word, who Scripture says was born when the languages were divided. Of course, he was born during the time of the Tower of Babel incident. So this harks all the way back to that with this Perez and the division idea, that his kingdom is being divided into the Medes and Persians. Last slide, we're done with this is the end of the chapter, verses 29 to 31. Then Belshazzar commanded, and they clothed Daniel with purple and placed a necklace of gold around his neck, and they made a proclamation concerning him that he would be the third ruler in authority in the kingdom. Well, big whoop because of the next verse. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received his kingdom when he was about 62 years old. So That's it. You get to be king for a few hours, or you get to be third in the kingdom until the end of the day, when he's killed and Darius the Mede takes over.
In many religions, many belief systems say, well, I'm good enough. Well, this is very interesting. It's not much has changed because God made him. In this case, I've checked it out. Your scale is out of balance.
All right. Well, the fact is, if I was to be weighed in the scale, I would be found wanting. Every one of us would be found wanting. This is why we rely on the King of Heaven to show us grace. Why we go to Jesus, his Son. He is not wanting. He was not. So I have to be identified with him if I want to be accepted. Because on my own merits, I'm weighed in the scales and found wanting myself.
That's why humility is so important.
Yes. Something that Nebuchadnezzar learned the hard way over and over, but Belshazzar apparently never did. This is the why. Why did Babylon fall? Because of pride, because of refusing to acknowledge the King of Heaven. And that's the why that this chapter gives us. Thank you for studying the book of Daniel with me today. I hope you'll join in the discussion by posting under the YouTube video, or hop over to Facebook and find the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group where we can continue the dialogue there. Or you can always just email me at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net. I'd love to hear from you as we continue to study the treasures in the biblical text.